When it comes to intonation, there's a lot to pay attention to on the bassoon. But the trick is some of the issues are with students and their playing technique, and some of the issues are actually with the construction of the bassoon. So many instruments have natural tuning tendencies, and so the bassoon is no different, and there are quite a few notes that are actually generally out of tune, but that combines with all of the issues that a student might be having with their air embouchure balance or their reed or what have you. So it's important to try to first assess by tone and visually assess basically what problems the student is having before assuming that it's a bassoon problem. Although you need to know both pieces to start diagnosing intonation problems. So a good list of student problems would be that air embouchure balance, first of all. So if they're not using enough air, then what's going to happen to the intonation? It's going to go down. So less air means lower pitch. And at the same time, if they are biting and the tone sounds really, really pinched, then that's going to do what to the pitch? It's going to go up. Biting and lip pressure raises the pitch. So if they're sharp on some notes, it could be that they're just biting, or it could be that they're playing a sharp note on the bassoon. If they're real flat, it could be that they just aren't using enough air, or it could be that that note is normally flat when you play it on the bassoon. So that's why it's important for a student to be educated about the air embouchure balance so that they're always working for their very best support and their best practiced technique balancing the air and the embouchure. Reeds, of course, are another big possible issue. So with a reed that's really too stiff, or even a reed that for some reason is too short, a student might just be sharp all the time, or on more notes than they normally would be. And at the same time, if a reed is too soft or too long or has other issues, or maybe dying because the strength of the reed is kind of degrading, they may be flat all the time. So knowing some things about adjusting reeds then may be your solution. Student problems include sharpness in the low register. So playing down low requires a big open voicing, a do or a da, playing down low. And if a student's using too much lip pressure, they're just going to be sharp. So sharpness in the low register is pretty common. And at the same time, flatness in the higher register, because there's so much more air required there. And generally, if the air's not there, then a little bit of pinching occurs, and that just frequently won't actually get the pitch as high as it needs to be. So flatness in the high register, starting especially around those flick key notes, that's really common just based on student error, based on them not using enough air in that register. Finally, if the tone is just sharp and thin in general, then you've probably got a student who's biting and using too much lip pressure, or the reed has started to dry out. And it's really important, I'll mention again, it's really important that that reed stays soaked during rehearsal. Oboists can do this, but bassoon players really need to do this. They need to be re-dipping that reed during rehearsal even, or maybe during a performance. But they need to have that water with them at their chair so that they can re-soak the reed as needed. It essentially sort of softens the reed up a little bit and makes it more playable. And obviously, if there's been any reed adjusting or practicing on this reed, most of the time it is soaked. So make sure that your bassoon student has the opportunity to re-soak a reed as needed so they're not playing sharp just due to a dry reed. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of bassoon tuning tendencies, and those are in the workbook and also on this page. But there's at least one that I'll mention, which is when we learned about half-hole G, for instance. When we learned about half-hole G, which is the regular 6 fingers with the whisper key and then a half hole at the top, that note came out super sharp. And that one is such a big issue with the bassoon that students are taught to add the low E flat key right here from the very beginning. So that's an example of a major bassoon intonation issue. And if the student's just not using the pinky, well, that's kind of a bassoon problem. It's a student problem because they're not compensating for the bassoon. But it's an inherent problem with the construction of the bassoon. So it helps to be educated on some of those obvious intonation problems. So take a look at that chart that indicates sharpness or flatness on some commonly out-of-tune notes on the bassoon. Now, let's say that your bassoon player is playing great. They sound really good, but they tend to be kind of flat all the time, even on the notes that are not flat on the bassoon typically. Okay? So if they've gone a little bit flat, then what they might need to do is actually use a shorter vocal. And that's where those vocal numbers come into play. Now, if you don't have a shorter vocal, for instance, if they've been playing on a 2, they would probably need to move to a 1 to get a shorter vocal. But if you don't have a shorter vocal, if you have a 3 instead, well, then you might consider investing in that vocal or having the student buy their own vocal, just like a brass student might buy their own mouthpiece as the mouthpiece they used initially gets a little too small. So vocal length is an appropriate way to make a macro adjustment to intonation. In other words, we're adjusting every single note by changing the length of the bassoon a little bit. At the very tip of the very entry to the instrument, by the way, any adjustment in the length of the instrument up there near where you play is going to make a huge difference compared to anywhere else on the instrument. So reed length, slight variations in reed length, or just that slight variation between a number 1 and a number 2 vocal can make a real difference in the bassoon player's intonation. In the same way, if the bassoon player is playing sharp all the time and they sound pretty good, they might need a longer vocal. So they should move from a 2 to a 3. Those are appropriate ways to tune using the vocal. There is an inappropriate way to tune with the vocal, which is what many of us sort of guess if we don't know how to tune the bassoon, which is to just pull that vocal up out of the vocal well a little bit to try to get the pitch to go down. Obviously, generally, you're not going to be able to push it in further, but pulling it out a little bit sometimes seems like the right thing to do. It's very similar to other instruments, but on a double reed, that vocal is designed to be fully inserted into the vocal well. When you lift it up, you potentially expose some wood under there that shouldn't be, and even if it's not wood, it's not designed to resonate with that extra gap underneath the vocal. So leave the vocal pushed in all the way and use these other methods to help the student play in tune. Whether you need to rework the air embouchure balance, or change the length of the vocal, or just see if the reed has dried out during rehearsal. So there's a lot to know, but keep an eye out and make sure that you know the difference between common student bassoon intonation problems and common bassoon instrumental intonation problems, the ones that are built into the bassoon. If you know both of those things, you can combine them when you're assessing an intonation problem, and you can establish the right solution for the student. So those are some of your basics on bassoon intonation.